Good evening and welcome to our panel on trauma and the crisis in Ukraine. We have tonight with us a very distinguished panel of psychologists and clinicians who will be speaking to various aspects of the question of trauma and the experience of war, especially how it's being experienced currently in the crisis in Ukraine. When we started this series, this is our fourth talk in our series on Ukraine, which is a special focus of a larger effort that my colleagues, Ronnie Perelis, you can see here, my other colleagues, Joshua Carlip and Stephen Fine, began over a year ago to bring to the YU community current event topics that spoke to the struggles, the complexity of modern life in the 2020s. The Ukraine series fits into that very well. And in the end, we will hope to be collecting all of these to present as a single unit of these talks dedicated to discussion of the crisis in Ukraine. This program has many generous supporters. It's received such an outpouring of support from the institution that I need to take some time to thank, in particular, the Rabbi Arthur Schneier Program for International Affairs, the Emil A. and Jenny Fish Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, the Bernard Revel Graduate School of Jewish Studies, the Yeshiva University Center for Israel Studies, the Yeshiva University Political Action Club, the Dunner Political Science Society, Yeshiva University College Democrats, and the Yeshiva University College Republicans. Just as a bit of procedure for this evening's program, each of our panelists will be discussing their topic for about 10 to 15 minutes. This should leave us time at the end for both a discussion amongst our experts, as well as the opportunity for members of the audience to participate if they would like to ask questions. If you do find over the course of the remarks that you have a question, please type it into the chat and I will be able to see it, and then I can present the questions at the Q&A time. One other note I just want to bring is that all of the previous panel discussions related to this series and the earlier series of our presentations, YU Crisis and Hope, are available at the website of yu.edu/crisis and hope. That's all one word, lowercase letters. And with that, I would like to present our provost, Selma Botman, who will, our stalwart supporter, who will say a few words of introduction.
Thank you, Jess. So I want to echo Jess's words, thanking the panelists for helping us understand the traumas taking place in the Ukraine. I also want to thank those who are attending this evening for showing support to the panelists. So we've all looked in horror as the Russian invasion of Ukraine has swept its citizens into firsthand dreadful experiences with war. We know that millions of people are displaced, fleeing for their lives, an exodus that Western Europe hasn't experienced since World War II. Women, children, the elderly have had to abandon their homes and families and everything that brings comfort to their lives. The impact on their psychological health will be profound. The United States knows a bit of this. We know the effects of PTSD on first responders and those serving in the military. And we wonder what kind of toll will be exacted on those on the front lines in Ukraine, those people, those men and women volunteering to defend their country, and also the men, women, and children who've been forced to flee and abandon their homes. Tonight, our panelists will reflect on this tragic moment in Ukrainian history and help us understand the trauma its people are experienced. So I look forward to the comments tonight and thank you all.
Thank you, Selma. So now I'm going to introduce our panelists, and I will be introducing them in the order in which they will be speaking, but I'm going to go through each person's name and their credentials and what they're bringing into the talk today before we get started. Lisa Henshaw, our first panelist, is clinical assistant professor in the Wurzweiler School of Social Work and a licensed clinical social worker. Professor Henshaw's research interests focus on trauma, including unrecognized trauma, complex trauma, challenges related to the diagnosis and post-traumatic stress reactions, post-traumatic growth, secondary and indirect trauma, and evidence-based treatment for active service members experiencing post-traumatic stress reactions. Dr. Henshaw will be speaking about trauma from a biopsychosocial perspective, laying the groundwork for the foundational understanding of trauma, its definition, its parameters, as we will be delving into more detailed studies with our other speakers. Dr. Nancy Beckerman is full professor at the Wurzweiler School of Social Work at Yeshiva University. She's published widely in areas of AIDS, psychosocial impact of chronic illness, faculty education, diagnosis and treatment of PTSD, and family and couple therapy. Dr. Beckerman is a clinical consultant to numerous hospitals, community-based healthcare agencies, and is a psychotherapist and clinical supervisor. Dr. Beckerman will be speaking on the psychosocial implication of trauma on war refugees. Our third speaker is Vera Békés. Vera Békés is an assistant professor of clinical psychology and co-director of the psychodynamic program at Ferkauf Graduate School of Psychology at Yeshiva University. Her research focuses on trauma and psychotherapy, and she's especially interested in collective and transgenerational trauma. Dr. Békés will be talking today about the short and long-term psychological consequences of trauma, including moral injury and transgenerational trauma. Finally, Dr. Jordan Bate is assistant professor of clinical psychology at Ferkauf at Yeshiva University. She received her PhD in clinical psychology from the New School for Social Research and a BA in history and political science from Williams College. She completed a postdoctoral fellowship in clinical psychology at Lenox Hill Hospital. Among her many professional interests, Dr. Bate is interested specifically in the impact on individuals and families of trauma and adverse childhood experiences, as well as interventions designed for pregnant and postpartum women and new parents. Dr. Bate will be speaking this evening about the effects of war on children. And with that, I would like to introduce our first panelist, Dr. Lisa Henshaw, speaking in a general sense, the background of trauma from a biopsychosocial perspective.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for having me tonight. So I would like to give a general picture for folks about the definition of trauma, just to lay some of the groundwork, like Jess said, for my colleagues here, talking about some niche aspects. Just starting by defining what a traumatic event is. And how we understand a traumatic event is that it really presents a threat to our physical integrity and one's safety. So this could be a direct experience of trauma through an individual experiencing an automobile accident, a natural disaster. It could be a physical or sexual assault. And of course, an example is also war. An individual can witness a trauma themselves, or they can also be indirectly exposed to trauma by learning about a traumatic event of a loved one. And really, this explanation that I'm offering is aligned with the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual's definition. That's mainly how we categorize traumatic events here in the United States. So that would be important to identify as well. So expanding outward, when we're talking about a traumatic event, a question we would ask is, well, is this a single event trauma, or could it be considered a complex trauma? And single event trauma is really exactly what it sounds like. It's kind of a standalone event that's a traumatic event that someone survives, whereas a complex trauma, we're really talking about exposure to multiple traumatic events over time, or it could be something like an ongoing chronic trauma, like surviving captivity, surviving a longstanding abuse or sexual assault. And for those purposes, the complex trauma, often the response and the implications are typically more profound. War as a traumatic event, really, I would categorize it more in a complex way, because it's a multiple traumatic events happening over time, right? So we're talking about not just one event, something that's over a period of time. And we're talking about large scale violence. It can be individual assaults that are physical or sexual, that now we're hearing about, and the inherent association of loss that comes with the trauma of war is something, for social work and in our biopsychosocial perspective, we really want to consider what are the implications: loss of identity, loss of home and physical belongings, loss of family and friends. And trauma and loss often go hand in hand together. There can be a lot of ambiguous loss in terms of the role and the identity that one had in their community. They're forced to leave their home, or, and relocate. So there's a lot to understand in a multidimensional manner, not unidimensional. There's a lot of different facets, and we want to be aware of that. The next aspect of trauma that I want to talk about related to war is that, trauma is so nuanced, and when we think about traumatic events of war, we think about a collective, right? So we want to understand that a collective trauma is really something that is experienced by a group of people, right? It can be a small group of people, but it can also be a whole society of people. And that's something that has a little bit of a uniqueness to it, because there's a narrative that plays out among a collective trauma that's different than just a single event if an individual survives it. The group of people remembers the event in a certain way. So there's individual narratives, there's group narratives, and then there's also institutional narratives in terms of, well, how is this, what's the messaging across the world, globally, and news outlets, politically, what's the messaging, and how is this story told over time in the history books, right, in the textbooks in schools. So being a collective trauma has also specific characteristics, and the way that it's remembered in the memory of the persons who were surviving it. Now, I believe my colleague is going to talk a little bit more about this, but I do want to mention the nuance of historical trauma, because this is a region that has experienced and survived historical trauma. And that's really important to note in terms of, how does that impact the individuals today that are there? A historical trauma, in essence, is a collective trauma. It's survived by a group of persons who really share cultural or identity or affiliation. And the persons don't have to be present at the time of the actual traumatic events to be impacted by the historical trauma. It can really survive over time. So there's a lot of complexities, and I know I'm kind of moving in and out of different areas here, but that's the message I want to really share with you all who are here tonight, because it's not just, it's not singular in dimension. There's a lot to consider. Another aspect that's important is the racial trauma that is potentially occurring in the region in terms of, racial trauma, how we define it, really perceived threats or real threats to one's safety based on racial discrimination. And we want to be aware that that's something that could be occurring, and that we've heard in different outlets, different social media. So how does that contribute to the complexity of the post-traumatic stress reactions? Okay, I just want to move through here a little. So the last piece of, kind of defining a traumatic event that I want to speak about is really the indirect potential trauma that persons who are living in Ukraine or around the globe can really experience. It's not something that categorically in the DSM is really part of the scenario of diagnosis right now, but research shows us that just watching the news across the globe, home and abroad, if it's something that's in your community, if it's something that's outside of your community, that you can be impacted, and persons can experience post-traumatic stress reactions just through indirectly observing or witnessing, and that could be through watching the news. So that's something important to be aware of. when we're talking about the social work conceptualization and the biopsychosocial understanding, we want to identify the neurobiological and the physiological aspects of trauma, you know, our nervous system, how it receives the experience is a huge piece of psychologically then how we fare afterwards in our mind and coping. And that moves into the threaded needle of our social context in terms of our environment and, you know, our identity, our role in the community. Do we feel safe? You know, have we, is there a job that's affected, other relationships that are affected, right? So we want to think about the psychological lived experience, but also the socio-political context. What policies are in place? You know, social workers really pay attention to understanding the socio-political environment and the context, the messaging, the power dynamics, what oppressed persons, the vulnerable persons in that environment, in that community are really experiencing. We're looking at a basic needs and biological needs, but we're also looking at a human rights perspective, right? And everyone has the human right in terms of safety and shelter. So it's a balance across a broad scale to understand the implications of, you know, all these different nuances of trauma on an individual's life, on their family, and on the collective of that community. So I'm trying not to be too jargony or wordy. I hope that's a little bit comprehensive for everyone as a jumping off point. And I'm watching the clock for 10 minutes and I want to make sure I don't go over. So I hope that was helpful just to start it off a little bit with some general terms.
Absolutely. I think that really sets it up very nicely for the rest of the discussion for the evening. Thank you very much for your remarks. We now turn to Dr. Nancy Beckerman, who will be speaking on the psychosocial implication of trauma on war refugees.
Thank you, Jess. Good evening, everybody. I do want to thank Provost Botman for her role in supporting this. And I want to thank Dean Ronnie Glassman, who alerted my colleague, Dr. Henshaw, and myself of this activity tonight. Thank you so much, Dr. Henshaw. That is a very helpful start. I'm going to move us a little bit closer to the moment that we've all been living through, whether you have relatives that are in harm's way, whether you're sitting in front of CNN or Twitter and watching just the last few days. What's been happening is just really beyond description. So we're going to move to talk a little bit about war refugee trauma. Some basic facts. As of this morning, the UN is saying that there are over 4.2 million Ukrainian refugees. 6.5 million people have been displaced within the country. Over 90% are women and children. They've been forced to flee their homeland from this war. More than 10 million, then, approximately a quarter of the country's total population, has been fleeing for their lives and displaced. Nearly 1 million Russians are also trying to flee their homeland. So this is just extraordinary and heartbreaking. Refugee trauma speaks to the profound and at times incapacitating sense of loss. They may experience, as Dr. Henshaw explained, whether it be flashbacks, nightmares, startled response, difficulty concentrating, eating, sleeping, functioning in just the most basic of ways, given the extent of loss and trauma. The war, the violence, the terror, if you are just watching on CNN and having nightmares, if you are reading the paper and you have to stop, you have to take a breath because your nervous system is in some disrepair. You can only imagine what the forced separation from their families, their homes, and of course their country and community of origin, the toll that is taking. We have more than 50% who have had to wait in refugee camps. Take a second and picture that. Just 6 weeks ago, these were folks just like us, working in school, pursuing their doctorate, pursuing their master's, taking care of their kids, worried about day-to-day life, and have now had to survive living in dangerous conditions during migration, living with the existential unknown of their future, and of course, living through feelings of shock, terror, and loss. If you add to that the sights, the sounds, the smells that we have been protected from, you can understand the nature of the complex trauma, as Dr. Henshaw spoke. This is not a single event, but compounded trauma. Being forced to flee, refugees have experienced unspeakable and compounded loss. It's hard for us to even talk about tonight. I feel myself getting a little choked up, so I apologize. The loss of property, home, what we understand as security, what are we eating tonight, what are we picking up for dinner, all of that is gone. And of course, we have loss of family. If most of the men are either conscripted or have decided to stay and fight, will we see our spouse again? Will they see one another again? Will they see their kids again? So the loss of that primary relationship and emotional attachment, the neighborhood, the culture, the language, the rituals of the norms, and of course, a sense of safety and a place of belonging. We also haven't even touched on loss of livelihood, income, identity. I'm Dr. Beckerman tonight. Would I be if I had to run across carrying a cat or dog or a grandchild under my arm? It would not matter that I'm Dr. Beckerman. We come all the way down to the basics of food, water, medicine, shelter, the ability to take care of ourselves and our family, which of course, for anybody that is part of the social work field or psychosocial or clinical, we know that Maslow's hierarchy of needs starts with physiological and the safety of shelter, of food, of hydration, so that we have folks that do not have the luxury of a sense of belonging, obviously, esteem, self-actualization. They're in a survival mode. There are massive community trauma creates pressures on the responding systems. All right, we spoke about folks that have lost their livelihood, the socio and economic pressures on the adjacent countries at the border and welcoming these refugees. There has to be a massive movement of food, of water, of temporary shelter, sanitation, medicine, and of course, trained psychotherapists, physicians, trauma-informed interventions. Dr. Glassman had shared with me, she came across an article that Poland has summoned all of its psychologists to provide trauma treatment at the border. The UN High Commission on Refugees, those headquarters in Vienna, say that many refugees undergo a lengthy process, and this involves their numerous staff. Staying in a refugee camp, initially, we had all prayed and hoped that this was a matter of days. We see now that some are living in a refugee camp. It's not temporary. We're into the 5th week, heading into a 6th week, long-term, not a short-term solution. So these prolonged stays will contribute to, and we'll hear later from other esteemed colleagues, the impact on children and families, but on anybody, we see the amount of trauma this is going to produce. Very briefly, what would a resettlement program in a host country have to try to attend to? The idea of welcoming, integrating these individuals, families, communities, helping them find a place in their religious institutions, in education, in medical, housing, job development, retraining opportunities, language perhaps, all of this to enhance the attachment and belong, at least in a temporary way, in a new community. I do want to build on Dr. Henshaw's presentation to say a little bit that's very specific to trauma as it relates to war refugees and immigrants. The first is the traumatic stress, and that's marked by dislocation and the profound losses and uncertainty. The second is acculturative stress, the uncertainty or conflict with a new culture and norms. The resettlement stress, poor living conditions, homelessness perhaps, surely the possibility of poverty, unemployment, lack of health care, disruption in education. And finally, the other area of stress and trauma for this population is referred to as isolation stress. Here we have somebody that's not able to find their way in this new neighborhood, community, culture, et cetera, and may even be the recipient of harassment, discrimination, and whether that's at school or work, we have somebody that's going to end up feeling very isolated. What I really would want to leave us with, I'm winding up, is that the impact is on the family. Parents have to take on new roles. Mothers have had to become single parents. Children are asked to become parentified for younger siblings. Families may become trauma organized systems, which means that all their patterns are related to the traumatic experience that they've been living through. And so it's important to understand that exposure to this complex trauma and the PTSD in many different forms will affect the ability for this family to function, whether it's the children and their education, their ability to concentrate, or mom and or grandma, whoever else is part of the family, what they've been through. And finally, when listening to or trying to support those that have been impacted by this trauma, I do want to give last little points. Remember that every trauma often reminds us of a previous, whether it be a related trauma or an unresolved trauma, that we want to provide safe engagement, do more listening than talking with somebody. Even if it's somebody that is saying, I can't sleep at night from watching the news, it doesn't have to be that you're on the front lines. Allow that friend or neighbor to start the conversation and follow their rhythm about it. And please be alert to those that might be particularly at risk because they have pre-existing trauma. For those in the audience who are mental health practitioners or volunteers, we really want to make sure that you're able to give yourself the proper break from this news, self-care, and so that you can regulate your own needs during this stressful time. I want to thank you again for having me. It's really, it's not my pleasure, but it does feel very important to be with colleagues and with the Provost and Jess and Ronnie tonight to talk about this. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Nancy. And it's absolutely our pleasure. And thank you for a very, very moving and very, very powerful discussion. Next, I would like to invite Vera Békés, who will be speaking on the short and long-term psychological consequences of trauma, including moral injury and transgenerational trauma.
Thank you so much. I think that my presentation will aim to add some new aspects, or maybe just elaborating more on certain aspects. So first, I would like to talk a little bit about trauma and psychological consequences of trauma, and what resilience means in this context. I think that we hear resilience a lot nowadays, and just to orient ourselves how to understand this term. And I also would like, as Jess already mentioned, to talk about the long-term consequences of trauma, including transgenerational trauma, and the role of moral injury in all this. So first, just kind of summarizing trauma and the psychological consequences. So many of these things have already been mentioned. And I would like just to add that psychologically, I think that trauma is something that overwhelms the capacity of the individual to cope with a certain event. And this is really important because this means that it's not just the traumatic event itself can constitute a trauma, but the consequences of the trauma as well, and the whole process of, for example, seeking refugee status and asylum and so on. The immediate reactions to trauma are multi-layered, so it can be an affective reaction in terms of anger, sadness, or grief. There are cognitive responses such as self-blame, which is very common, negative thoughts about the world and other people, and possible safety in the world. And they can occur in any combination, this kind of experiences. It also happens that people don't feel kind of anything, they feel numb after experiencing trauma, which is also a typical, relatively typical consequence. Is just a sense of not having any emotions and feeling empty. It is also important to know that sometimes people experience delayed reactions, like during the trauma, they don't feel the so-called adequate emotions that we would expect them to feel, but they are either feeling numb or are in denial or are just really in survival mode. When in order to be able to cope with the upcoming challenges, everyday challenges, resolve new situations in life, they just have to kind of cut off the emotions and just go on kind of resolving problems, and the emotions will come later. So that's also something that we see, and it's important to know that the emotions are still there and they might come later. Usually the symptoms, the trauma symptoms that people experience after trauma exposure are reduced over time, and they decrease and disappear, but sometimes they do persist over time. So a proportion of people who experience traumatic events will develop severe consequences such as post-traumatic stress disorder and commonly depression and anxiety as well. As it was mentioned already, PTSD symptoms include a range of really unpleasant, horrible experiences such as vivid flashbacks of the trauma, intrusive and unwanted memories, difficulty sleeping, having nightmares, and also avoiding any situation, people, or object that might remind the person of the trauma, which can cause a lot of trouble later on adjusting to a new life as well. So what is resilience in the context of trauma? Resilience is the ability to kind of bounce back after experiencing adverse events. And this bouncing back is usually conceptualized as an ability to go back to pre-trauma levels of functioning. So we can imagine that a potentially traumatic event happens and then people respond differently. Most people experience some kind of stress. It can be a huge amount of stress or maybe lower amounts of stress, depending on many factors. And resilience would mean that after this initial sense of stress and suffering, people would go back to the original pre-trauma level of their stress or how they function normally. So in resilience research, originally, it was thought that resilience, this kind of capacity to kind of bounce back, it's something exceptional. So it's like super coopers are those people who are able to just go on after a trauma and return to a normal level of functioning eventually. Now, later on, research found that actually resilience is the most common reaction after experiencing traumatic events. Now, there is plenty of research and various meta-analyses and reviews that are showing that most commonly people experience an initial increase in symptoms, depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress. These are the most commonly measured symptoms. And then with time, over, let's say, 1 or 2 years, the symptoms go away and they can function as they did before the traumatic events. Of course, there are other trajectories of adaptation after traumatic stress, and there are many factors that will decide whether a person can react or adapt resiliently, or there will be other trajectories. One important aspect, again, is that there is a so-called delayed trajectory, which means that people might react with some symptoms of mental health problems initially, and then instead of these symptoms decreasing, it gradually goes in an upward trajectory, which it's called delayed trajectory, meaning that even after 2 years after the event, they are experiencing more symptoms of psychopathology than right after the event. So this is important to kind of know. In this context, many people ask whether post-traumatic growth has anything to do with resilience or PTSD, or how does it work? So if somebody is resilient, does it mean that they will experience post-traumatic growth? So post-traumatic growth is a kind of personal growth as experienced, not because of the traumatic events, but because of the way someone is able to cope with the trauma. So that's a kind of a different concept from resilience, and it denotes an ability to kind of function on a higher level than pre-trauma after an adjustment. So as I mentioned, there are many factors that impact the trajectory of adaptation after trauma, and these are all important to consider in terms of the situation, the war that is going on in Ukraine, and how people are experiencing it. There are individual differences, of course, and a lot of these were mentioned already. Environmental support when the trauma happened, the personal past experiences like a previous trauma, proximity of the trauma, whether the person experienced it themselves or they just heard about it or they learned about it through media, for example, severity of the trauma, length of the traumatic situation, which can really be prolonged in these situations as people are fleeing from the original trauma, and then on the way they are experiencing more and more trauma as they are trying to go through, for example, through the border and find a new home, or passing through countries and try to find a new life and build something totally new from the ground. It's also important that the nature of the trauma is really important in developing long-term symptoms. So the research has found that those traumas that are man-made, like human triggered traumas, lead to more severe psychopathology and mental health consequences compared to, for example, natural disasters. And this is really important because this is the aspect where for example, moral injury comes into the picture. That these, so when it is human-made, the trauma, and it could have been avoided, then the survivors, of course, understand the situation very, very differently, and it has very different consequences emotionally and cognitively than natural disasters or catastrophes. So what do we know about trauma in refugees, just to bring it a bit closer to our topic? So research shows that between 1/3 and 1/2 of the adult refugees experience PTSD. This is a very high number. It is 10 times more likely to experience PTSD for an adult refugee than somebody in the general population. So 10 times more likely that a refugee would experience PTSD symptoms. Besides PTSD, which we would expect in relation to the traumatic experiences, depression and anxiety are also really prevalent in refugee population. Numbers are different, but a recent study found in Syrian refugees that after resettling in the US, so this means that theoretically the traumatic phase was over, they were experiencing 40% experienced high levels of anxiety, and 50% experienced depression, clinical level depression. This is extremely, extremely high. But also it's understandable if we are thinking about what the previous presenters already mentioned, that these people are going through several traumas. It's a chronic, stressful situation in which multiple traumas are accumulating, and also the transgenerational trauma and historical trauma that is in the background. So this was also touched upon already, that, for example, in Ukraine, several traumas, collective traumas happen, not in the 30s, the famine, and also the Second World War, and so on, and later on. So it's a collectively traumatized group of people, and these all contribute to the impact. A few words about the transgenerational and collective nature of the trauma. So we know about transgenerational trauma, that the trauma that is experienced with one generation doesn't stop at that generation, but can be passed through to the next generation or to the next generations. This was first studied in Holocaust survivors, but later on in many other populations. For example, in the Armenian genocide, in apartheid in South Africa, Ukrainian survivors of the Holodomor famine, and so on. And also in refugees, Iraqi, Syrian, Vietnamese refugees. The transgenerational impact of trauma was found in all these populations. And there are a lot of research now turning towards trying to understand how it is possible that the trauma is passed through generations. I will not go into the details of how it is happening, but it's a fascinating field of study. And I think that this will be very relevant to, unfortunately, to the present situation as well. Finally, a little bit about moral injury, and then I will stop there. So moral injury is a recent term. So it was just introduced about 10 years ago, but it is growing exponentially in terms of research and focus with regards to trauma and understanding the role of moral injury in experiencing the detrimental impact of trauma. So as I mentioned, human-caused traumas are more often lead to the development of PTSD, and moral injury is generally conceptualized as kind of lasting psychological impact of perpetrating, failing to prevent, or bearing witness to acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. So it means that in moral injury, someone experiences acts that are in deep conflict with their basic moral beliefs. This causes a kind of moral pain when the event is happening. And it includes various reactions such as moral outrage, anger, feelings of betrayal, a loss of faith, grief, but also guilt and shame. And these are experiences that we might be experiencing as well as we are listening to the news or are hearing about, families' stories and so on. This kind of moral outrage of how is it possible? How could this happen? Moral injury was originally developed in a military context, but has been applied to various contexts. For example, to the healthcare workers who were working during the COVID-19 pandemic in really high stakes situations when they had to make decisions that were really hard. So there is a huge fascinating research about that, but the concept of moral injury has been applied in many other areas as well. What research found was that in events that are potentially morally injurious events, people who experience moral injury are more likely to develop PTSD, depression, and anxiety, and other mental health symptoms. So this is important in order to understand that we are not only talking about PTSD, which is kind of the direct consequence of the trauma, but there is a strong moral aspect that adds additional variance to experience suffering and mental health symptoms. And this is really important to address as well. So these were the couple of things that I just wanted to bring up to think about and be aware of these concepts and how to understand the impact of what is happening in the world in terms of what we know about collective trauma and trauma in refugees. I'm happy, if there are questions, I'm happy to talk about a little bit intervention and what can be done But it was very nice already how Nancy, Dr. Beckerman, already mentioned these couple of things that are really helpful in support. So thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Békés. Really appreciate your comments. And I think that I've seen some of the questions start to appear in the question and answer, and I do think that we will have some questions. So thank you so much for your remarks. Finally, I would like to invite Dr. Jordan Bate. Dr. Bate will be speaking about the effects of war on children.
Right. So as everyone else has said, thank you, Dr. Olson, Dr. Perales, and Provost Botman, and really the YU community for the invitation to participate in this conversation. As I'm going to talk about, being able to take a positive action is really important in moments like this. So being able to share my knowledge and thoughts on this topic really means a lot. The latest numbers I read cite that even before Ukraine, 1 in 4 children live in countries affected by armed conflict or disaster. And as Dr. Beckerman already explained, of the 4.2 million refugees and 6.9 million displaced people in Ukraine, 90% are children and women. And I want to begin by acknowledging that psychologists and really more specifically psychoanalysis has had a long history of engaging with the community and particularly with children in times of conflict and war, going back at least to World War II when Anna Freud and Dorothy Burlingham created the war nurseries in and around London to care for children and families during the Blitz. And John Bowlby elaborated attachment theory when he observed children who were sent from London to the countryside where they lived in foster homes where they would be safe. And he saw that even though they were physically safe, these children still suffered detrimental effects, not due to violence, but as others have alluded to, due to the separation from their parents and their home and their families. And I want to start here because I think these key learnings from Freud and Bowlby and others are still really relevant when we talk about how children are impacted by war and how we can care for them. First, I think all children need a primary caregiver, and it doesn't need to be their mother or father, their parent, but they need someone bigger. These are Bowlby's words: bigger, stronger, older, wiser, who can be a safe base and a safe haven rather, and a secure base for them. Someone who's emotionally available to help them understand and make sense of their experiences and their feelings. And this is crucial for all children, but attachment research shows that it's especially necessary for children who face adversity like war. So following from this, as really everybody else on the panel has said, the traumatic experiences of war for children are not at all limited to exposure to violence. Anna Freud wrote in 1943, and I'll quote her, "Home is the place to which all children are determined to return, irrespective of the fact that in most cases they're aware of its destruction. War, above everything else, signifies the period of time for which children have to be separated from their parents." And often these are not necessarily even physical separations, but parents in needing to find solutions for their families and find safety, might temporarily not be as available to them. Although I'll talk more about that in terms of resilience and actually the amazing capacity of parents to be available and how we should be careful to not pathologize. But war, it causes for children, like it does for adults, displacement. They experience death and loss. More often it's the loss of fathers, but also disruption to their education, the lack of resources that have been mentioned. Their sleep gets disrupted, which is so vital to their development. And this is all on top of the everyday stresses of being a child and the developmental stage that they're at, navigating social relationships, learning, romantic relationships. The effects of war on children are similar to adults, but those working with children and working with child refugees, it's important to recognize children might not display trauma symptoms in the way that adults do. Children may be more likely to display aggression or conduct problems in addition to depression and anxiety. They might also exhibit self-blame. Younger children especially don't have the context. They feel like when things happen, they must have done something. And children are also likely to express their trauma in somatic symptoms, headaches and stomach aches. But also, like what Freud and Bowlby saw and what Vera just talked about, is that not all children who experience trauma show trauma symptoms. And many, especially those with secure attachments, those who have had the fortune of not being separated from their primary attachment figures, might, be resilient and proceed on a relatively healthy developmental trajectory. So I think it's really important with children that we think not just about their symptoms, but how to support their well-being and their overall quality of life, which is where research on risk and resilience comes in. So Vera gave a preview to this, and others did, and I don't have time to go into all of it. But one thing I want to emphasize is that resilience, the thinking has evolved. I think a lot of us think of resilience as an individual trait that a child has or doesn't have. And of course, there are individual qualities that promote resilience, like emotional intelligence or a child's cognitive coping strategies, or their ability to mobilize the supports around them. But when we think about children's risk and resilience, we need to, like Bowlby and Freud were, be considering the contexts that they are embedded in, namely their family and community, and the ecological model. So I've already talked about attachment, so I won't speak any further right now about the family level. But what research shows is that just as important as family is the role of community in children's well-being and children's resilience in the context of war. And of course, school is the primary community for children. And when children are not able to go to school due to displacement, they're at increased risk of PTSD. So if people out there are considering what you can do to help children, organizations that support teachers and access to education is really crucial for children, that they can continue to have a predictable school environment that can be a safe haven for them, a place for community and connection and belonging. So I do want to spend a couple minutes on the issue of what we can do. Given that resilience is not an individual trait and that it's based on a dynamic interaction between individuals and families and communities, I think to support children, you could have probably guessed, I think we need to really be thinking about how to support their attachment figures and their attachment networks. And as I said already, I think it's critical that we not assume psychopathology, and that those who are providing care for refugees and children who have been impacted by war not go in looking for psychopathology and something wrong. Refugees have shown, tremendous feats of emotional and often physical strength that Dr. Beckerman described, I thought, really beautifully. And like I said, parents have shown amazing levels of care for their children and protecting them. So even though parents are stretched to their limits, parents who have experienced trauma often show even increased caregiving and availability to their children. So all of that said, I think there's certainly a place for the individual and symptom-focused treatments that we're especially used to talking about in the United States when we think, especially in terms of a medical model of mental health. But I think therapists and social workers who are working with refugees and children who have experienced war, really, the people who have done this work really emphasize that we need to focus on providing spaces where children and parents and communities can be children, parents, and communities, where they can engage in recreation and connection and expression. That doesn't, especially for children, that doesn't need to be talking. So being able to play, either pretend play or sports, being able to create and express themselves through art or writing or dance or theater are all really important resources for children to have in terms of treating trauma. And that's not to say that there isn't a time and a place for the therapy models that we know are effective. But I just want to, to be careful about the assumptions and general leanings that we have to the idea that these things should only be talked about in a private room with a therapist, especially when, like others have said, it's a whole collective and community that's experiencing these things. And so research with kids shows that some of the therapy approaches are actually better off provided in schools through the classrooms, where they can be provided to on a tertiary basis to everyone, because everybody's experiencing this, and that reduces stigma around trauma as well. So I have just a minute, and I want to talk about one other question I see and hear a lot, being someone who lives and works and practices in New York in the US, although I'm sure there are many in the YU community who are other places, which is, how do we talk about this war and war in general with children who are not the children living through this directly, but as everyone has acknowledged, are experiencing it through the media. So for parents and people who work with kids that are curious, these tips come largely from UNICEF and other organizations that work with children and some of the research. And I think, first, talk to kids about what they know already, how they feel about what they've heard. Help them figure out how to cope with their feelings, whether it's anger or sadness. Like I said at the beginning, figuring out positive actions they can take to help them channel those feelings. Media is a tricky one, because obviously we all want to protect ourselves from the really graphic, violent images that others have mentioned can be traumatizing. But media, child-appropriate media is really important for children to get facts and have a full understanding of what's going on. When children don't understand what's going on, it's more terrifying. But when they have the full story, that's really helpful to them. And also, a lot of child media has, children from other parts of the world talking and sharing their stories. And that's really valuable for children. And communicating to children what people are doing to help, what actions are being taken. I think it's Mr. Rogers said, look for the helpers. So all of those messages for kids are really important. And of course, for parents and adults here, teachers taking care of themselves as well, so they can be available to help kids through this. So I just want to end with a quote from John Bowlby that actually my mentors from the New School, Miriam and Howard Steele, often reference, and I thought really belonged here. So Bowlby wrote this in 1951. Just as children are absolutely dependent on their parents for sustenance, so in all but the most primitive communities, our parents, especially their mothers, dependent on a greater society for economic provision. If a community values its children, it must cherish their parents. So thank you. And I just touched the surface, so hopefully this leaves us plenty of time to talk.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bate. So I am going to open up the floor to some questions. We had a couple of questions come in. I was going to take this, my chair prerogative and ask my question first, but I actually see a question that's popped in that I think is really pressing and worth just putting out there right away. And that is, and it's a very practical question, are there resources that you can provide for us to share with our family and friends in Ukraine that would be of value in terms of those? And I'm guessing that the questioner, whose name I can't see, is asking out of an actual need. And I think that's something that probably a few in our community, and perhaps even in our meeting tonight, might have the same question.
I have a quick answer. I know that UNHC is a good resource. Also, REZON is a Ukrainian resource. And I believe it's, I'd have to look it up, but I thought it was, and the other panelists may know it, National Child Protective Network. I think that's its name. So I know those three organizations are sending materials that are family oriented to the refugees.
Any other panelists have anything to add?
Oh, go ahead, Ronnie.
Nancy, can you repeat Rezone? How do you spell it?
REZON.
I've seen that. Okay, great. Thank you.
I'm going to double check the spelling in case I remembered it wrong, but I'm pretty sure that it's that.
No, because I've seen that name around. It's clearly doing good things on the ground there. And
Yes.
that's great. Thank you.
They're reputable.
Yeah. I mean, I think everyone's looking for that.
Yeah, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network always has really excellent resources to share with families about how to speak to children, how to bring it up, how to engage children, especially with a family focus.
Yeah, I guess I was going to actually clarify the question, what kinds of resources they need, whether they need, information about how to talk to children. I was going to say the same one. So yeah, also I think, for anyone with loved ones in Ukraine, finding out what it is they need right now, which I'm sure this person that asked did, but if they want to specify what kinds of resources, certainly.
I'll put the question out there and hopefully there will be a response. So we'll wait to see if that comes up. I'm sorry. I just want to clarify the name of the organization is Razom.
Yeah.
R-A-Z-O-M.
Yeah, just put it in.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. razomforukraine.org is where you would reach that.
Yes,
so please.
Someone said resources for themselves, like family members in denial. I'll just say something that I always say to my students when we talk about denial. And I think it actually relates to Dr. Halpern's question as well, that denial can be a really important defense mechanism. Denial protects us from having to, from being exposed to that overwhelming fear and terror. And so, one thing I think to think about is, why someone might be in a state of denial and what they might be needing to protect themselves from. And I think that's true for in terms of war and many other things in our world that people are in denial about. So that is my note about that.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that clarification.
Can I do a piggyback or?
By all means, jump in.
I'm gonna piggyback as every academic does. I would like to add that certainly from the social work perspective, we teach the same thing, and we always say it's important to replace or replenish the support or resource internally or in the community, a support group, et cetera, before ever taking away a defense. And so that movement is important, and somebody's in denial for a reason. So we want to make sure that they have other supports. Thank you.
Thank you. So I want to put out a question that was posed a bit ago from Julia Martin, who has a question for Dr. Békés, which I think may also have some others might want to weigh in on. So she writes, I believe you mentioned that trauma can be passed down from subsequent generations. If that's the case, how will it manifest itself in the next generation? What kind of is it a depression or any other kind of disorder that we tend to see, and in what way?
Yes, thank you for the question. So that's a very, very complex thing, how it gets manifested. So it's very, very complex, similarly to complex trauma. It's not a syndrome. It's not something that we could really describe by checking off certain features. It can manifest itself in depression, in any kind of general anxiety, even PTSD symptoms, vulnerability to certain things. So maybe that's the more common thing that has been found that there is some kind of stress vulnerability. So people with transgenerational trauma might be more vulnerable to develop certain conditions after or bigger stress reaction after they experience a later stress reaction than other people. So there's no one syndrome to mention here. And also, as families are so different, every parent is different, every child is different, the dynamic in every family is different. So it's really, really complex. The way how we can understand what happens is that these kind of traumatic experiences don't just get transmitted directly, but they go through kind of parenting styles, attachment patterns, communication about the trauma and about anything else. And these kind of subtle information molecules are kind of taken in by the child, and they create something very unique, and it will manifest in some kind of form.
Would others like to weigh in on that?
I was going to say, I can expand a little bit just from an attachment perspective, and I'll try to do it simply and briefly. So let's say you have a parent who's been exposed to, who's had a trauma, and they have a lack of resolution of that trauma. So let's say they, they have dissociative symptoms, so they might zone out, or let's say they have, heightened arousal, so they get startled, or things like that. So we're thinking about parents and babies. These things are happening unconsciously. What happens then for the baby from an attachment perspective is, so this is a warm, loving parent, who's had something horrific happen to them and been affected by it. But what the child ends up experiencing is, like, at certain moments, their parents unavailable for them. And often those are the moments that they're in distress. Sometimes their distress can trigger the parents' trauma. Selma Freiberg called this the ghosts in the nursery, when she asked the question of, why do some parents not seem to be able to notice their baby's cries? And it's because they had cries that went unmet and unresolved. So that in that process, when the baby's in distress and their parents not available to them, and again, I want to emphasize, these are like loving, warm parents who have, significant trauma. But then what happens is then, the baby is alone, and they're experiencing a sense of what Mary Main calls fright without solution. The person they need is not really available to them. And then, that has long-term effects. And there's a physician I like the work of, Gabor Mate, who's a Hungarian physician in Vancouver, and he was born and during the Holocaust, and talks about his mother going through the Holocaust in Hungary with him as an infant, and how that impacted her availability. And so he describes trauma as, it's not what happens to you, it's what happens inside of you because of what happens to you. And it's the disconnection from the self that happens as a result of trauma. So I think what we can do for parents and people to prevent the intergenerational transmission of trauma is help them reconnect with themselves, to feel whole, to make sense of their feelings and experiences, because it's largely unconscious.
Just one little thing to add, because this is, sorry, just often it's a misunderstanding. So research found that in general, for example, in traumatized people's second generation, the mental health problems in general, they are not higher. They are just as well functioning, healthy people as anybody else. Just sometimes there is this vulnerability. So it's just to emphasize that it's, again, just not to pathologize. It is just part of kind of a complex picture.
Thank you. I want to move on to another question. This is actually, I'm going to actually bring in a question from someone very close to me, my wife, Kara, who was wondering, her question was, to what extent has the overlaying of this trauma after 2 years of the COVID pandemic, how has that, in your opinion, or would you speculate or maybe know, shaped the experience of this trauma, that, you know, essentially trauma upon trauma? I mean, you can then extend from that. I mean, I have to bring my history hat in here, right? I mean, as we've spoken before, I mean, this is a part of the world in my own work that I've seen through multiple like traumas that are beyond, you know, really comprehension in this particular corner of the world. So I'm curious what people think about that, the overlay of COVID with this particular trauma. That's open to anybody.
I was going to defer to Dr. Henshaw, who spoke about complex trauma, but I think we would all agree on that front. But Lisa, did you want to say anything more?
I really think you can't separate them, in my professional opinion, because when you have the larger environment is one huge kind of holding of unsafe experiences, and you don't really know if you're going to be safe and healthy, and if you're going to lose somebody. And there's been so much overwhelming loss as well related to COVID. So it's superimposed trauma, it's superimposed loss, and having to kind of redefine, you know, Dr. Bate, excuse me, is talking a lot about selfhood and that connection to oneself and identity. And so much of experiencing both individual and collective trauma is that disconnection that occurs within the self. And it's an ambiguous loss because we're still there. And that's what makes it so challenging, is how do we find ourselves? So you may have had a lot of individuals, families, adult children reacting to COVID in a very appropriate way with traumatic stress. They could have been teetering on the edge. They could have been, you know, there's such a broad range of trauma responses. But I would really be concerned for their reserves, you know, and if there was even a small break in the self, it could really challenge somebody. And I think from a social work perspective, the outside resources are just so scarce, right? And those supports, you know, the personal, political, and the internal, and how we meet our own needs and the needs of others. You know, someone asked a question about vicarious trauma. I mean, it's all part of this, you know, complex, unique experience that even everyone on this panel and everyone who is here is going through. So I think it's really important to recognize. And there's another question about, can we harm someone by talking about a trauma? But one of the most important pieces for individuals who are enduring or surviving trauma is to recognize it, right? We don't want to take away somebody's power because there's so much powerlessness that comes with enduring trauma. So we want to always give the person the power to speak about it. Like Dr. Beckerman was saying, we listen. If they're ready to talk about it, great. But we don't pretend that it's not happening, right? Because history really, society really has a strong history of minimizing, of denying traumas. It's still happening, right? People are still denying certain traumas today. And we want to always recognize, we want to validate person's experiences, person's selfhood. And I think to recognize that COVID is a global trauma that's impacting persons is equally important, right? Because we want people to feel, have that opportunity to process, right? And that's going to leave more potential for resiliency, for post-traumatic growth, for redefining the self. If we can recognize all those experiences and what could be contributing to challenges, right? Most of the time survivors say, oh, I feel like I'm going crazy, right? Because there's such a neurobiological component physiologically of what happens and psychologically. And when you can't find yourself, you do feel that way. And something as simple, not simple, but, you know, COVID is everywhere and now it's kind of par for the course, but it doesn't mean it's still not impacting us, right? And when you superimpose that on something as extreme as war, right? In all of its facets, it must be considered, in my opinion.
Thank you very much. Any other panelists want to weigh in on that question? Well, great. In that case, I'm going to move on. I actually would like to sort of take a moment and ask a question of my own. as an analyst, as a mental health practitioner myself, I find myself wondering, what is going to be the demand as we move forward, as we move past this moment, or even during this moment, but then past this moment? How are we likely as people in this field, what's going to be demanded? What are we going to be needed? I guess I'm asking, what should I really bone up on so that I can be of the most help, right, in doing this kind of work, right?
I'll start. I think trauma informed, if you haven't done your
Right,
research.
well, clearly a
I'm
part of
sure-
my education, but
I would think so,
Yeah.
but seriously, trauma informed and the very complex, I know that word has been used a lot tonight, but unique manifestations of it at different levels. We haven't even touched on the amount of racial reckoning and racial justice and oppression that's been part of the collective psyche over the last 2 years. And I think that if we looked at the client base, if we look at that through the lens that we've discussed and talked about tonight, we want to see, are folks able to help themselves to regulate, or are they dysregulated? And in that, what type of trauma-informed care would be the most comprehensive? I think the idea of us, up until a few years ago, looking at trauma, and originally it was from combat, but it moved to the idea of domestic violence and single event trauma, somebody who was assaulted. Now we understand it is complex trauma. Listening to Dr. Henshaw and the other panelists tonight. And so I think the primary lens would be trauma informed, whether they present with an eating disorder or interpersonal conflict. Everyone has been through a certain level of trauma over the last few years. And so that would be my initial response about what to bone up on further.
Please.
I would also add, just part of my research on unrecognized trauma, and I mean, to be humble about, the experience of COVID and that we're still learning, and the complexities of all these traumas on top of each other, trouble and the piling up, kind of losses. I think what Dr. Bate talked about with denial, the knowledge, being trauma informed, that we are to some extent in a survival mode, right? To be able to endure and cope and function through this kind of chronic experience of all these traumas on top of each other, and that we don't have one reaction at one time to trauma. I think that's one of the most interesting pieces to me. It continues to unfold, the person's story, the person's narrative, and that's one of the best things because it can change over time in a positive way. But as a practitioner, we have to be aware of that. It's not just telling a story and then that, goodbye. It's how it continues to, develop meaning over time as events, close up or another event happens. And this is certainly a very, I think just unique time in history. To see how it unfolds, I think too, is behooves us, right? To say what we don't know everything, and we have to do a lot of research too to understand it.
Actually just wanted to, I'm so glad you said that, because it prompted me to think about our own humility, as, certainly for those that are, therapists or providers of some kind. I think, our own humility in these moments. We talk a lot about cultural humility in clinical work. And I think, cultural humility is important here in trauma work as well. And I think also, not to be cliche psychodynamic therapist, but I think also really being aware of what's going on for ourselves, and how we are impacted by things, what our own reactions are. We are all navigating the world too, and I think we are at the end of the day, I think Harry Stack Sullivan said, we're all more simply human than we are otherwise. And so we are, at the end of the day, two humans sitting in a room together. And I think we do have, as a responsibility as the clinicians in the room, to be aware of where we are so that our own stuff does not come in, including like our rush to be helpful or our rush to be clever or our rush to solve a problem, that we don't intrude on our patient space.
And to be aware of shared trauma. I'm not, I don't want to get into a whole other tangent, because that's something I've been really looking into and researching as well, but that's a reality, and it's something to be very aware of how it impacts our practice.
Yeah, and we have mentioned vicarious trauma previously, and I think that this is really important to be aware that especially younger clinicians, according to our previous research, is they are very, very vulnerable to experience vicarious trauma, especially during the COVID pandemic. So just to give support to the more junior colleagues who are starting off maybe online, they have never seen a patient live in person, just to understand the differential processes and how this can be vicariously really impact them.
I think our own networks of support are really important. I mean, I think doing stuff like this, I think like talking to other, talking with other professionals, like I feel better, more trauma informed going into my day of work tomorrow after this conversation with all of you.
So I wonder if, I didn't put this into the chat, but as you're speaking, I'm wondering if your students, because you're in psychology, you're in social work, I'm wondering if your students bring this up, and if you feel like you're in something of a clinical environment in answering what otherwise might have been an academic question.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We had a faculty meeting the day after this all started and said, let's put our heads together. What do we anticipate? How do we want to respond? And it has absolutely been an educational moment that has had some blurred boundaries of clinical as well. I've had several students come to me and say, I have family there, or I volunteered for several summers there with orphans, and I'm beside myself. And so again, it's another collective trauma. I imagine that every faculty member who's teaching this type of dimension of work, that this has come up.
Importantly, graciously, we have some good research, trauma-informed teaching and trauma-informed education. And I think there's been a lot more contribution to that after COVID as well, to really guide us in terms of, meeting students' needs in a boundaried way that's ethical, but that also is trauma-informed and recognizes, well, you're learning in a broader environment that is has a great deal of trauma happening, and we know how trauma impacts learning. So it behooves us as educators to really recognize that and say, well, you might have challenges concentrating, or this may be difficult for you to process because you're feeling very anxious, right? However, let's pivot back. So offering resources in a boundaried way, and the university has great resources that we refer students to as well. And I think that's very important to support students' learning.
Yeah, I mean, I'm imagining in some ways so I'm also on sabbatical this semester, so I'm actually not in the classroom this semester amidst all of this, but I do imagine, obviously I only teach in psychology, but in some ways our classrooms and the things we're talking about are conducive to processing this together. But I think, for people in other disciplines, this does, what Dr. Henshaw was just saying made me think about students in math and science and, business and all these other disciplines, like they are being affected, and there probably aren't the spaces to be processing it and talking about it in the way that we try to navigate, because we're very aware of in psychology how it's going to affect our work with patients. So I do think it's something, across education, we're, having to think about how we, do trauma-informed teaching in some way.
thank you very much. And with that, I think I'm going to bring our event to a close. I really appreciate the thoughtful questions that were offered and the terrific answers and the terrific discussion, and just a really I feel this is a first-rate panel. I just want to thank again Dr. Henshaw, Dr. Békés, Dr. Bate, and Dr. Beckerman for your participation. I also want to thank my colleague, Ronnie Perellis, for making this all possible. And finally, again, I would really like to thank Provost Selma Botman, who I said it somewhat cheekily at the beginning, but who really truly has been a stalwart supporter of the work that Ronnie and I and others of our colleagues have been doing in this. And I just can't thank you all enough for this great evening. So if I could just beg your indulgence to thank our more financial supporters of the Rabbi Arthur Schneier Program for International Affairs, the Emil A. and Jenny Fish Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, the Bernard Revel Graduate School of Jewish Studies, the Center for Israel Studies, Yeshiva University Political Action Club, the Donner Political Science Society, Yeshiva University College Democrats, and Yeshiva University College Republicans. And once again, this program and all of our past programs broaching subjects ranging from questions of racial and social justice in America to Israeli television show about the experience of religion, to these very powerful discussions of what's happening in Ukraine today, are all available at the URL of yu.edu/crisis and hope. That's all lowercase letters in one word. So thank you all again to the panelists and participants, and I hope you all have a nice evening.
Stay safe,
Thank you.
everyone. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much.